story's protagonists, Josepha and Geronimo, are brutally punished after Josepha gives birth to their illegitimate child. She is sentenced to death, while Geronimo rots in prison. As the bell tolls, announcing the procession towards her execution, Geronimo prepares to hang himself. Then the earthquake hits. The walls of Geronimo's cell are reduced to rubble, freeing him, while Josepha escapes. Kleist writes this: "She had only taken a few steps when she found before her the mangled body of the archbishop, which had just been dragged out from under the wreckage of the cathedral. The viceroy's palace had collapsed. The court of law in which she had been condemned to death stood in flames, and at the site where her father's house had stood, there was now a seething lake, spewing a hot red steam. The earthquake offers an image of grace, a great intercession of destructive nature on behalf of the damned. Yet it was not the grace that I fell in love with, but rather destruction. In the shattering condensation of these two sentences, the earthquake does away with religion, sovereignty, law, and patriarchy. The indiscriminate violence of the earthquake gives way to an accounting for these manifestations of power. Far from creating chaos, this earthquake brings about a great simplification, under which debased social forces are named. Being seduced by these sentences is quite different to awe at the earthquake itself, to which I too must imagine that I will succumb. It is the seduction of a sort of vengeance, with a clarity of sight that strangely averts its gaze from the destructiveness of destruction, in order to revel instead in the remembered image of what was destroyed. The new world gives way to a backward-turned glance. The earthquake simplification heralds a logic of abstraction. Under this aspect, religion, law, sovereignty, and patriarchy are destroyed through synecdoche, as the archbishop, the viceroy, the court, and the house of the father. These become bearers of meaning. In this talk, we'll consider some questions that deal with questions of destruction somewhat otherwise, and we'll open a field of language and questions of negativity against the law, against sovereignty, against religion, against the patriarchy, in a way that does not seem to sink with them all into the natural catastrophe of the earthquake. But we might also not straightforwardly embrace these abstractions, and instead we'll pose some of these questions historically. And I want to mention also a second temptation, which is maybe an opposite pole to seduction by this like destruction abstraction thing. And that's the temptation that afflicts us as literary scholars, or those of us who spend our lives like toying with letters. There's the joy of playing with words that are caught on themselves. Writing that depicts words seems perpetually to bring their difference from the words they depict into question. A statement like, "In the beginning was the word," and these words from the very beginning of the Gospel of John seem to wonder how its own linguistic composition might become like the word that it announces, how it might wander into itself, or how it marks its distinction from the words described. One can barely resist playing with these forms or acting out their shape, with the assurance that their internal reflection will offer us grounds within a play of some reality. This is something like a theatre of language, in which the signifier and the signified measure the abyss between the staged word and its audience. And it's easy to postulate some Brechtian solutions to this setup, even in the broadest strokes, that the audience might be brought into the realm of the stage as an element of the word's productive force, or otherwise their inclusion might take place through a distancing of the petrified gesture of the word's appearance, giving a view onto a generalized condition of alienation in social life. And so I guess these two types of temptations might be opposites. One's a destructive temptation, one's a constructive, like construction within language. And I mentioned them at the outset, not because they're particular paths I'm going to go down, but because they operate in proximity to some of the poems that I want to discuss. And the question I really want to ask in this talk is like, when is it right to be seduced by these types of thinking? Like, when is that okay? Or like, what are the conditions of it? So that's kind of an odd question. I mean, I know that we're normally sort of supposed to shy away from seduction and temptation and all of that stuff in academic writing, but these are honestly things that I'm sort of tempted by. I'm going to start with a couple of poems that address some questions of destruction and linguistic presentation of language. And these two poems form a partnership. They're both drawn from the Svendborg poems, which Brecht wrote during his exile in Denmark during the 1930s. The first is titled The Invincible Inscription, and I'll read it. At the time of the World War, in a cell in the Italian prison of San Carlo, full of arrested soldiers, drunkards, and thieves, a socialist soldier scratched in crayon on the wall, "Viva Lenin," right up high in the half-light of the cell, hardly visible, but written in huge bold letters. When the guards saw it, they sent a man with a bucket of whitewash, and with a long-handled brush, he painted over the threatening inscription. But because he simply followed the outline with his whitewash, on the cell wall, it now said in whitewash, "Viva Lenin." Then a second painter painted the whole thing over with a broad brush, so that for several hours it was gone. But towards morning, when the whitewash was dried, the inscription re-emerged, "Viva Lenin." Whereupon the guards sent a builder to chisel out the inscription, and he labored for an hour scratching the letters out one by one. And when he was done, high up on the cell wall, in no color now, but scratched deep into the wall, the invincible inscription, "Viva Lenin." "Now remove the wall," said the soldier. The counterpart to this poem is a single verse from the German War Primer, which is the first part of the Svendborg poems. And it's a really short thing. It just says this. On the wall stood the words in chalk, "They want war. He who wrote it has already fallen." These poems look simple at first glance, and I'm just going to take us back to the first one. The Invincible Inscription, which recounts a story that Brecht had found in a book of testimony, and it takes the form of a joke. But the function of the joke relies on a reversal that might not be immediately recognized. At first, it appears as though the slogan praising Lenin is an image of a type of revolutionary strength that cannot be overcome by prison guards. However much they try, it reappears, transmuting from the pale chalk line to the lines of paint to the deeply incised inscription. But in the course of the poem, a radical reversal takes place. With the final line, it is no longer the guard, but the prisoner who commands its overcoming, with which the wall too must disappear. The power of Lenin in this final act of destruction is not to be used, but is to be used up entirely and put at his service. The peculiar power of the invincible inscription is, under changed circumstances, its power to be overcome by the true and correct forces of destruction. A similar course might be sketched more lightly in the second poem. We're given a slogan once scribbled on a wall. It speaks to a present in which the enemy wants war. The poem's final line reveals that the scene itself is set into the past, as he who wrote it has already fallen. The scribbled message speaks forwards into some unknown time, ripped from its present as a warning for the future, and as it is preserved, becomes a different type of warning about the historical trajectory that has already taken place, and to which its author has succumbed. The final line of the poem returns us to the past tense of the first, as the reader recognizes from already too late that this message too, preserved in the poem, has already succumbed, like its author, to be erased by the enemy's history. While it's possible to elucidate some of the formal dialectics of these two poems, this says little of their content, which addresses the question of inscription. In the play of time of the joke, with its repetitive attempts at destruction that instead fixate a message, followed by a command for its true and ultimate freeing destruction, or with the final line that reveals the message the poem preserved has already been effaced, a wider theme is revealed. The theme is a question of communist poetry and the relations between destruction, preservation, transmission, and the use of words. While staying with Brecht in Denmark in 1938, Walter Benjamin set to work on a series of commentaries on Brecht's poetry. Benjamin was attentive to these historical questions, and his conceit is outlined in an opening reflection on the nature of commentary. He noted that the form is usually reserved for classical texts, for which the appraisal of enduring quality of the work is assured. Commentary is thus considered both archaic and authoritarian. Yet here he would apply the form to a set of texts that has, quote, not only has nothing archaic about them, but which defy what is recognized as authority today, end quote. He founded his effort on, quote, the knowledge that tomorrow could bring destruction on a scale such that yesterday's texts and creations might seem as distant from us as centuries-old artifacts. Such a thought also occurred to Brecht. In a strange little text written around the same time, titled From Journeys into Modernity, he wrote, after the Great Wars, my work was discovered in the vault of a fascist national library alongside other degenerate literature. An equestrian statue of me was erected on a children's playground. I hurried along to see it.
Thank you so much.
On the whole, I was satisfied.
How come they're waiting?
Oh, got someone speaking. So on the whole, I was satisfied with the statue. The artist had chosen to portray me with a friendly expression, which I heard had been requested in the commission. I understood that this was an honor, recognizing my friendly attitude towards coming generations. But why a horse? I asked my companion. It indicates he dates back to antiquity, was his answer. And between us, there is yet another reason. Horses are completely extinct. The statue was intended to kill two birds with one stone, insofar as it preserved the form of this animal in memory. Yet where Brecht speculates on a future and the strangeness of its statue as a vehicle for historical transmission from a time now destroyed, as hidden texts are disinterred from a vault, Benjamin's commentaries refused the service of vouchsafing Brecht's work for any future fame. Benjamin's commentaries draw a number of Brecht's poems into relation by way of a common dialectical image. This image is one of engraving words in stone, the wearing or yielding of this stone by liquid, and the effacement of the text. This image slips through the work under the shadow of borders and amid regimes of exile, appearing in variation, viewed from shifting and partial perspectives. In some cases, the image is drawn from the poem's thematic content. In others, the image determines the conditions of commentary, with poems entering into the image as words engraved in stone which disappear. Here a new image is forged, one of the engraved words' disappearance. Some poems command this effacement, others teach its lesson. Through the imagistic transmutation of the poems from graven text into fleeting image, Benjamin would argue for a specifically fugitive and destructive art amid the catastrophe. And to add another peculiarity to these commentaries, Benjamin revisits certain themes of his earlier works, and I'm going to give some special attention to some of this reworking. Benjamin's first commentaries return to Brecht's poems of the 1920s collection Domestic Breviary. Turning to the poem on the sinners in hell, which I'll put up here, in which Brecht describes friends and acquaintances, all sinners who have found themselves in hell. In the flames, they yearn for someone to cry on them and for the tears to alleviate their suffering. For sinners in hell, it's hotter than you think, yet if someone weeps for them, the tears fall soothingly on their heads. After presenting his friends, all unlamented because of poverty, insignificance, and exile, Brecht wrote himself into the final stanzas. And here in the light, there stands Bert Brecht, next to the dogstone. He'll get no water, since people think he must be in heaven. He's burning now in hell. Oh, weep, my brothers, or else on Sundays he will stand forever by that dogstone. Benjamin reads this poem as a particular form of inscription for the unredeemed. The poem names the friends in the enduring flames of hell, the way certain Bavarian roadside markers list people who had died unshriven and request passers-by to intercede. Yet despite its local origin, this poem really does point back a long way. Its lineage is the lament, and one of the greatest forms of medieval literature. We might say that it harks back to the old lament in order to bring proceedings against the newest, that lamentation no longer even exists. This poem's inscription becomes that of markers on a road, part graves, part demand that those who pass by halt and aid redemption, part threat that should they travel on, they too might suffer this fate. This road doubles upon itself. The view down it induces a vertiginous diplopia that forces one to constantly stop. Not only is it the road of lamentation, a Via Dolorosa, in which every station is marked with friendship, but a road whose way stations point back a long way And what better archetype for lamentation than a road leading towards death on which the traffic's movement is perpetually punctuated by stops? This road might be history, albeit one travelled in tragic time, or rather it is a street in which all that was not properly tragic was left at the wayside, unredeemed, forcing those who passed to halt. The commentary implies a persistent shifting between the damned held still as the traffic passes, and the traffic held still by the unredeemed, admonishing them in graven script, locomotion in freeze frame. This road along which lament, a constant stopping or intercession, brings a proceeding, all that is left of language, that there is no more lament, and hence no more stopping either, precisely where it stops, sets the scene of an image sunken into itself through its traversal into commentary and back. Where Brecht recognized the names of his friends and even himself, Benjamin saw a distant perspective ranging beyond them. In another text on Brecht, Benjamin described the same road as an image of tradition. In the secular drama of the West, too, the search for the untragic hero has never ceased. Often in conflict with its theoreticians, such drama has deviated time and again, always in new ways from the authentic form of tragedy, that is, from Greek tragedy. This important but badly marked road, which may serve here as an image of tradition, ran in the Middle Ages via Roswitha and the Mysteries, in the age of the Baroque via Gryphius and Calderon. Later, we find it in Lenz and Graber, and finally in Strindberg. Shakespearean scenes stand as monuments at its edge, and Goethe crossed it in the second part of Faust. It is a European road, but it is a German one too. If that is, one can speak of a road rather than a stalking path along which the legacy of medieval and Baroque drama has crept down to us. This stalking path, rough and overgrown though it may be, is visible again today in the plays of Brecht. It might be added here that the concern of a road composed of text had a particular contemporary relevance. As early as the mid-1920s, Benjamin's literary interests had spilled into one-way streets. Script is pitilessly dragged out into the street by advertisements and subjective to the brutal heteronomies of economic chaos. This is the hard schooling of its new form, locust swarms of print, which already eclipse the sun of what city dwellers take for intellect, will grow thicker with each succeeding year. If Benjamin presents a language with a new modernist spectacular capitalism, then in a note on the relationship between architecture and lyric poetry, Brecht describes a similar state of affairs in Russia. The photography of the Russian Revolution, not only that of 1917, but also that of 1905, displays a peculiar literarization of street scenes. Cities and indeed villages are littered with sayings as though they were symbols. With broad brushes, the conquering classes write their opinions and slogans on conquered buildings. Religion is the opium of the masses is scrawled on churches, and on other buildings, there are other instructions. On demonstrations, shields bearing inscriptions are carried. At night, films appear on the walls of houses. To return to the poem, Benjamin read Brecht's entire poem as an inscription, but his commentary concludes by returning this image into the poem with the stone that condenses together Brecht's lyric moment with Benjamin's long historical view. Where Brecht himself wrote himself into the poem, he does not yet appear as the stone, but by a dogstone, where he will stand forever. This dogstone becomes the center of Benjamin's reflection on Brecht's poor soul. It is standing in broad daylight on a Sunday afternoon by a dogstone. What exactly that is, we do not know. Perhaps a stone on which dogs urinate. To the poor soul, this is something as familiar as the damp patch on the wall of a prisoner's cell. The game ends when the poet, who after displaying so much callousness, asks callously for tears. It is unclear what will be wetted, the head of the damned Brecht from tears, or merely the stone that stands beside with the piss of a dog. But Benjamin's claim that we do not know the Hunderstein, this dog stone, proves deceptive. Glancing backwards down the road leading from medieval mystery plays through the Baroque Trauspiel to Brecht, we also know this posture, which stands beside. This familiar yet inscrutable dog stone in the final image of Brecht's poem prompted an inconspicuous reworking of Benjamin's study on an earlier graven image. The topic of lamentation had consumed Benjamin's intellectual energies in the late 1910s and the early 1920s. This work culminated with a commentary on Dürer's engraving Melancholia I, the Angel of Winged Melancholy, to which he claimed the German Trauerspiel dedicated its images and figures. And with this image, Benjamin conceived of an alienated mode of lyric, in which similarly Brecht might stand beside the dogstone. He describes Melancholia thus: the deadening of the emotions and the ebbing away of the waves of life, which are the source of these emotions in the body, can increase the distance between the self and the surrounding world to the point of alienation from the body. It accords with this, that in the proximity of Albrecht Dürer's figure, Melancholia I, the utensils of active life are lying around unused on the floor as objects of contemplation. Out of Dürer's engraved image, Benjamin draws symbols come objects that, as emblems of this new untragic mode. He says, the theory of melancholy became crystallized around a number of emblems. One of the properties assembled around Dürer's figure of melancholy is the dog. According to the ancient tradition, the spleen is dominant in the organism of the dog. This he has in common with melancholic. And further, one symbol seems to have passed over by the rediscovery of older symbols of melancholy embodied in this engraving and in contemporary speculation. This is the stone. Benjamin surely recognized the paraphernalia of melancholy recast in Brecht's unusual agglutination, dogstone, where an angel once sat writing. Now Brecht stands by the dogstone, the blazing daylight of a hellish Sunday afternoon. Where in the Trauerspiel book, the stone was associated with the cold, dry constitution of the earth and of an icy hell, this dogstone in hell demands a balm for unassailable heat. As Benjamin reads Brecht's poem, the old emblems of the engraving are raucously refunctioned for newer, darker times. Dürer's famously cryptic rhombohedron, which is that strange stone in the back of the picture there, a stone which nobody truly knows what it is, and this has been, I guess, an object of art historical speculation for a really long time, is what is this stone, is simply a stone for the dog to piss on. And is therefore like ultimately devalued. In the melancholic image of the Renaissance and the Baroque, the posture of standing beside the object signaled for Benjamin a new mode of knowledge, freed from eschatology. The great contemplator sank in melancholy into creaturely life. His unfaithfulness to man, I wonder if I have this quote, yes, his unfaithfulness to man is matched by loyalty to these things to the point of being absorbed in contemplative devotion to them. Melancholy betrays the world for the sake of knowledge, but in its tenacious self-absorption, it embraces dead objects in its contemplation in order to redeem them. A history of devaluation can be found in the thingly forms of what has been discarded by the wayside of this street. Benjamin saw as much in his late studies on Baudelaire, nomically remarking, the devaluation of the world of things in allegory is surpassed within the world of things by the commodity. For both Brecht and Baudelaire, this devaluation of the world of things is illuminated as alienation becomes lyric. Thus, Aegidius Albertinus's cool image of the melancholic quoted in the Trauerspiel book is repeated in the Brecht commentary with roles reversed. Unlike the melancholic, whose tears do not fall into his heart and soften its hardness, but he remembers a stone which, when the weather is damp, only sweats outwardly, Brecht inscribes himself into the poem, just as he does the dogstone at his side, or inscribes the dogstone that he stands beside, just as he would inscribe himself as a sinner requiring liquid redemption. Yet Benjamin does not see the historical lineage of the non-tragic detritus as itself constituting a Trauerspiel, forming a historical image within an image, a gathering of fragments, piling rubble upon rubble. A street does run through here in tragic time, even if the historical wayside, rough and overgrown, is increasingly crowded by the junk of the unredeemed works unworked. Traffic travels along at increasing speed towards catastrophe, less and less waiting and contemplation, as passers-by forego knowledge on their way to truth. With this perspective, in which no one is left to wait and contemplate, Benjamin's remark that one does not know what the dogstone is might be read differently. If in one sense the dogstone is a rebus to be scholastically solved, might we not imagine another dissolution in devaluation, just as the allegorical emblems themselves engravings fall away before each other in the closing pages of Benjamin's earlier book on the Trauerspiel? It is not so much that this stone is inscrutable, but that the correct relation to it, when even the melancholics have been moved along, becomes a divine mystery. Such a thought had already occurred to Benjamin. If melancholy emerges from the depths of the creaturely realm to which the speculative thought of the age felt itself bound by the bonds of the church itself, then this explained its omnipotence. In fact, it is the most genuinely creaturely of the contemplative impulses, and it has always been noticed that its power need be no less in the gaze of a dog than in the attitude of a pensive genius. In answer to such a divine mystery, we can glimpse the Messiah in a dog. This creature strides down the road of history, unaware of the tragic time of the traffic, stopping not to intercede on behalf of the unredeemed, but simply because a post engraved with their names is a convenient place to urinate, and he relieves himself. He brings relief to those burning in hell. Perhaps the urine effaces the names marked on the post, annihilating instead of fulfilling the callous demands of the damned. The piss falls as a surprise blessing on the heads of Brecht and friends. In a time in which there is no more lamentation, those in hell will have to take what they can get. The Messiah arrives as the Redeemer. So that's, I guess, one version of this. In his commentary on another poem in the collection, a poem on poor BB, the architecture of the street is transformed. Brecht writes himself into the poem with an abbreviated BB for Bertolt Brecht, as it might be inscribed in stone, invoking him in sharp abbreviation. Benjamin extends the image of self-inscription. Anyone who has read this poem has passed through the poet as if through a gate bearing the weather-worn inscription BB. Like the gate, the poet does not want to hold up the person passing through. The arch of the gateway may have been built centuries ago. It remains standing because it hasn't been in anyone's way. BB, who has never stood in anyone's way, would honor the epithet poor BB. For those who have never stood in the way and who do not count, the future contains nothing important except the decision to put themselves in the way, to make themselves matter. The later poem cycles bear witness to that decision. Their cause is the class struggle. Those who will stand firmest in this cause are those who started by letting themselves fall. The poet, imagined as an inscribed feature in the landscape, becomes the architecture through which the reader passes. The sign of his presence is weather-worn, but his historical import depends only on the architecture collapsing. This description of passing through the poet as through a gate might remind us of Benjamin's beautiful dedication to One-Way Street. This street is named Asya Lasse's Street, after she who, as an engineer, cut it through the author. But this gate, named Brecht, instead must fall, blocking the traffic. Where the street had once been a sublime site of destruction, allied with the long gaze of Baron Haussmann, who cut roads through the arcades, disinterring bourgeois life, this poetry sides with destruction beyond even that, annihilating its own text and texture, the body of self-inscription reduced to rubble, effacing its lyric inscription in the service of class struggle, the road closed. This new moment in the history of destruction has no intention to make space in order to find a way through. It simply interrupts the flow of traffic that did idle through. The street has been exchanged for a gate, now ruined, that is to fall in its way. The gate might variously form a threshold between one world and the next, or a border between territories. Once again, Benjamin reflects this image through his earlier work. He sets alongside the stone arch an image of a mouth. With Brecht's line, "The house makes glad the eater," he empties it. Benjamin remarks, "Here the eater stands for the destroyer. To eat means not only to feed oneself, but to bite and destroy. The world is immensely simplified if it is tested for the enjoyment it gives, if tested less for the enjoyment it gives than for the destruction it deserves. This is the bond that harmoniously holds together all that exists. The spectacle of this harmony makes the poet glad. He, the eater with the iron jaw, empties the house of the world. This passage draws together ideas from some texts Benjamin composed in the early 1930s. It repeats almost verbatim a thesis from the destructive character. Really, only the insight into how radically the world is simplified when tested for its worthiness for destruction leads to such an Apollonian image of the destroyer. This is the great bond embracing and unifying all that exists. It is a sight that affords the destructive character a spectacle of deepest harmony. Yet in imagining the fallen gate converging with a crushing jaw, Benjamin quietly returned to a less well-known text titled Fresh Figs from the collection On Food, which had considered the destruction specifically with regard to textual transmission. It described a scenario in which Benjamin had to make a difficult decision. A letter either had to be sent or to be torn up. The decision was suspended by a gluttonous devouring of fresh figs bought from a street-side vendor stand where he had stopped. I couldn't stop eating them and was forced to get rid of the mass of plump fruits as quickly as possible. But that could not be described as eating. It was more like a bath, so powerful the smell of resin that penetrated all my belongings, clung to my hands, impregnated the air through which I carried my burden. And then, after satiety and revulsion, the final bend in the path had been surmounted, came the ultimate mountain peak of taste, a vista over an unsuspected landscape of the palate spread out before my eyes, an insipid, undifferentiated greenish flood of greed that could distinguish nothing but the stringy, fibrous waves of flesh of the open fruit, the utter transformation of enjoyment into habit, of habit into vice. A hatred of those figs welled up inside me. I was desperate to finish with them, to liberate myself, to rid myself of all this overripe, bursting fruit. I ate it to destroy it. Biting had rediscovered its most ancient purpose. When I pulled the last fig from the depths of my pocket, the letter was stuck to it. Its fate was sealed. It too had to succumb to the great purification. I took it and tore it into 1,000 pieces. The text of the unsent letter is ultimately destroyed by the liberatory gesture of the biting mouth. Destruction is invoked as a counter-proposal to transmission, transmissibility, or indeed tradition. The letter is drawn into a mountainous landscape, the color, taste, and smell of figs transfigured, whose vistas too succumb to the mouth's work of great purification. Benjamin's commentary on Poor B.B. employs a similar motion. He produces a landscape in which the engraved gate of the poet is imagined to fall. Yet here, the text that is to be destroyed is the poet's own lyric evocation. This glad poet with the iron jaw might empty the house of the world, but what he bites on so destructively is himself. His own mouth is the gate that falls shut, the poem a lyric destroying lyric, making itself matter. Where Benjamin's commentary appears to counsel suicidal destruction, or something more than suicide, eliminating the soul and the memory as well as the life, where self-inscription appears only for the sake of its annihilation, this is not without ambivalence. These destructive acts do not occur as singular events within a stable, durable world, nor are they for everyone. Brecht's poetry is instead set into a destructive world, described by Benjamin's commentaries on the Reader for City Dwellers. Addressing the collection's first poem, with its famous refrain, "Efface the traces," he claims that these traces and their effacement belong to fugitives. Efface the traces, a rule for those who are illegal. If these poetic engravings had a message, it was only for those living outside the law. The message that they were to receive, if they were to receive one at all, was that of the message's own disappearance. This marks and unmarks a certain promise. Effacing the traces means going underground, but also not leaving a mark where you went under. Yet Benjamin continues, "Make sure," this is quoting Brecht, "make sure when you turn your thought to dying that no gravestone divulges where you lie." Now, Benjamin, this is the only rule that might be obsolete. Thanks to Hitler and his people, members of illegal parties have been relieved of this worry. The self-destructive lyric finds itself surrounded by a superior ubiquitous destruction, and in his commentary on the 9th poem, where he again claims the book contains object lessons in exile for living outside the law, he glibly notes, the rule of the first poem, efface the traces, can be completed by the reader of the 9th. It is better than having them erased for you. Benjamin's 1931 essay, The Destructive Character, had already described such a scenario of ubiquitous destruction, but there it was nature's destructive power that was supreme. It is nature that dictates the destructive character's tempo, indirectly at least, for he must forestall her, otherwise she will take over the great destruction herself. In this later work, nature's rhythm has been supplanted by that of Nazi troops. Brecht himself came to a similar conclusion in his 5 difficulties on writing the truth, now adorned with a caption. I might not read this whole quote, but after a great earthquake that destroyed Yokohama, many American magazines published photographs showing a heap of ruins. This caption read, "Still stood." And to be sure, though one might see only ruins at first glance, the eye swiftly discerned, after noting the caption, that a few tall buildings had remained standing. Among the multitudinous descriptions that could be given of an earthquake, those drawn up by construction engineers concerning the shifts in the ground, the forces of stresses, the best developed, etc., are of the greatest importance, for they lead to a future construction which will withstand earthquakes. If anyone wishes to describe fascism and war, great disasters which are not natural catastrophes, he must do so in terms of practical truth. He must show that these disasters are launched by possessing classes to control the vast number of workers who do not own the means of production. If one wishes successfully to write the truth about evil conditions, one must write it so that its avertible causes can be identified. If the preventable causes can be identified, the evil conditions can be fought. Right, back to our original poems briefly. Benjamin's commentaries on the German war primer explore the temporality of carved inscription in rock and yielding to water in these new times. The tempo of destruction once dictated by nature has been radically overtaken by the time of history. Noting the lapidary style in which the poems are written, Benjamin explains that, quote, the word arises from the Latin word for stone and is characterized by brevity, and that its purpose was to address subsequent generations. The lapidary style arcs between contradictory tempi. What speaks briefly in its own time speaks on through the ages. Media in which it takes longest to write can carry only the briefest messages. Yet, he notes, since the natural material conditions of lapidary style do not apply to today's poets, one is entitled to ask what corresponding factors are present. Benjamin's answer elaborates the motion of transmission outside the law. Brecht's inscriptions are fugitive. They do not speak through history's eternal laws of motion, but instead cut across those laws. Against historical time's mainstream, they transiently mark and block its limit, disappearing into exile. The war primer poems are not made for stone, they're made for their disappearance. Their motion is that of invisible transmission, which intensively and explosively composes a historical underground, counters that which marks its bounds by monumentalizing forever its victorious heroes. This book constitutes a lesson in reading at the moment of writing's disappearance and of apprehending the past in a time of new times beyond the deception of progress. In this context, Benjamin offers a new view of the image of effacement of engraving by water. He reads the poem, on the wall was written in chalk, they want war. The man who wrote it has already fallen. In this time of new times, a proletarian has not carved his words in stone, but instead has scribbled words in chalk, a stone so soft that it immediately yields. Benjamin comments, the character of the Kriegsfibel can be seen arising from a unique contradiction. Words which, through their poetic form, will conceivably survive the coming apocalypse, preserves the gesture of a message hastily scrawled on a fence by someone fleeing his enemies. The extraordinary artistic achievement of these sentences composed of primitive words resides in this contradiction. At the mercy of the rain and of the Gestapo agents, a proletarian scribbles some words on the wall in chalk, and the poet invests them with Horace's era perennius. The fascist has always banked on the text washing away, hoping that the proletarian would be washed away with it too, dissolving into history's anonymous torrent. Destruction or the effacement of inscribed words alone guarantees no radicalism. Rather, the combination of both elements into a new tempo of inscription and effacement proves politically decisive for Benjamin. Brecht's proletarian chose chalk of all the stones in solidarity with this insight. Meanwhile, Brecht's lapidary lyric responds not by holding off the rain, nor by holding back the fascist, but in its specific preservation of a text. It does not preserve the text as such, but only its gesture, the gesture of transmission itself in the moment of its disappearance, falling and going under, becoming like a lament sung out, in which the time of music is formed out of the realization that the lament itself must pass, just as the subject of its lamentation passed. Without the mercy of the rain, without the mercilessness of the fascist, he holds it still in display, a text as wound beyond the law, transmitting to all those others beyond, before, and to come, a warning, a signal, a primer. Dry, without the mercy of effacement, this lapidary writing both presages and survives the coming apocalypse. Brecht's poem preserves not the message, but the gesture in flight. Nature in rain is held back by a new resounding transient eternity in the shape of a fall. The image preserves he who wrote it as he who has already fallen. So here's Benjamin's big theory. Benjamin reveals the significance of the engraved stone and the liquid in reading Brecht's poem, Legend of the Origin of the Book Tao Te Ching in Lao Tzu's Road into Emigration. This poem was of great importance to Benjamin in the final years of his life. He took a copy to Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher in Paris, and during his internment in Nevers recited it and discussed its meaning with other internees. The ballad's narrative takes place at the border in rocky hills. Brecht tells of the aging sage Lao Tzu, who travels with a boy from a land where wickedness was gathering its strength again. The customs official stops the sage and asks if he has anything to declare. The boy explains that the sage has nothing because he taught. The customs official then begins to draw the wisdom from the sage. He invites him to wait a while and share his teaching. Benjamin remarks, once Lao Tzu had established the customsman's by customsman's right to ask, he resolved to take some time from his journey and oblige them, and places the World Historical Days under the motto, good, a brief stop. In the poem, the sage offers up his wisdom, that the soft water, as it moves, vanquishes in time the mighty stone. You understand, what is hard must yield. Benjamin's commentary transforms Brecht ballad into a fable with a lesson on friendship. The friendliness between the customs official, the sage, and the boy becomes the grounds on which the Tao Te Ching was passed down through the ages. Benjamin then explains the wisdom's image, which he grants political meaning. Kindness is displayed at the hardest points in life, at birth, at the first step into life, and at the last step, which leads out of life. This is a minimum program for humaneness. We find it again in the Lao Tzu poem, where it takes the form of the statement, what is hard must yield. The poem was written at a time when this statement rang in the ears like a promise nothing short of messianic. And for the present day reader, it contains not only a promise, but a lesson, that the soft water as it moves vanquishes in time the mighty stone. This teaches us that we should not lose sight of the inconstant, mutable aspect of things, and that we should make common cause with whatever is inconspicuous and sober, but relentless like water. Here, the materialist dialectician will think of the cause of the oppressed. For those in power, this is an unobtrusive matter. For the oppressed, it is a plain and sober circumstance, and as far as its consequences go, it is the most relentless fact. Third and last, in addition to the promise of the theory, there is a moral to be drawn from the poem. Anyone who wishes to see hardness yield should not let slip any opportunity for displaying friendliness. Benjamin offers the most beautiful illumination of the sage's wisdom. The image of the stone and water is at a stroke transfigured into political meaning by way of a parable with a class struggle. The water is the cause of the oppressed, inconspicuous, sober, and relentless. The opportunity for friendliness is the bed of this stream. Yet Benjamin's undoing of the word in a fierce and wonderful parable is troubling. He does not draw the sage's wisdom out of its poetic context. Rather, in reaching for immediate translations of the stone and water, he enters into the poem himself. Accepting this parable means disappearing entirely into the world of the image, as though it were a mystical symbol that solves in an instant the riddle of the world. The broken ground between text and image is no longer available, since in parable the two are made absolutely translatable and transparent. Reading the image of the stone and water by entering entirely into the image of the text of a life never lived is a devil's bargain. The virtuosic parabolist might take the sage's wisdom's truth to be as eternal as the rock itself, and therefore, despite his apparent alliance with the effacing motion of water, might preclude his own criticism. The glorious messianic illumination by parable contrasts with the inscribed architectural lyric body as an index of historical legibility, which is illuminated less by the light of redemption than by the blaze of destruction. The latter registers not the coming of the Messiah, but the distortions and deformations of the world into which he enters. Such distortions can never be understood under the logic of parable alone. This returning wrecked corporeal border holds between the living and the dead. In this world of unshriven bodies, the task of friendship becomes the medium of the tradition of the oppressed. This friendship, in which esoteric knowledge is passed down through the ages, is the destructive counterpart to all classicism and authority. Benjamin's parable might cast the image of water alone as a weapon, always ready to be taken to hand in the struggle against fascism. But the border on which this wisdom was imparted did not merely separate the blessed drowned from the damned saved in a deluge of freedom. If this effacing water is taken up as a weapon, its promise lacks constancy, even if it remains ready for the confrontation with the enemy. The tradition of the oppressed is the motion that whets the weapon's blade. But if this tradition is always ready to be taken at hand, then it does so just as the Messiah does, perpetually undressing one wound at a time and redressing the others, hunched amid the anonymous crowd at the border gate of the great city. What is taken to hand in the struggle is the medium of the relation to the dead, to those who did not escape, to the discontinuous course of historical failure. If the cause of the oppressed is like the relentless stream that wears away the stone, then this stream is not a continuous flow of events, but instead a concatenation of interruptions, an eddy, the endless coming to rest with the sage's word, good, a brief stop, and of those days of pause which Benjamin called world historical. Indeed, the encompassing image that combines the eternity of the stone and the transience of water might illustrate nothing less than the rhythm of this perpetual stopping as an emblem of eternal transience found in an eternity of downfall. This too gives shape to Brecht's poetry, drawn, as he says, from fragmentary sources, while encouraging his readers to accept it only with caution. When drafting his final work, the thesis on the concept of history, soon after he wrote the Brecht commentaries, Benjamin turned again to this problem of tradition. In a note he writes, under the title Problem of Tradition 1, Dialectic at Standstill, and dialectic at standstill normally in Benjamin's late work means Brecht. He writes, fundamental aporia, tradition as the discontinuum of the past in contradiction to the history as the continuum of events. It may be that the continuum of tradition is semblance, but then precisely the persistence of this semblance of persistence provides it with continuity. Fundamental aporia, the history of the oppressed is a discontinuum. The task of history is to get hold of the tradition of the oppressed. Morally, Saporius, the continuum of history is the one of the oppressors, whereas the idea of the continuum levels everything to the ground. The idea of the discontinuum is the foundation of real tradition. And I won't read the last, this second paragraph of this. The tradition of the oppressed, which brings the living into relation with the dead, is comprehended as the discontinuous medium of messianic revolutionary action. Thus, the dissolving center of the remarkable parable of the Lao Tzu poem gives way to a backwards glance that recognizes in the motion of dissolution splinters of the wreckage of the past. Beneath the seeming continuity of its liquid flow is a reality of the broken down, of the past interruptions. The border in this landscape, the site of the transmission of wisdom, is at once given shape and reduced to rubble. It is the wrecked border traversed between life and death. If this border might have marked their distinction in its ruin, in the blocking of that crossing, where one is forced to stop, it provides the site of salvation, conjoining the living and the dead in a new totality. Only the gaze turned backwards can apprehend it. Parabolic interpretation gives way to saturnine vision. The beautiful illumination of the class struggle with the image of the stream is overtaken by a landscape streaming and stilled with unshriven bodies amid the dereliction of historical failure. Meanwhile, all that was lyrical in Brecht's lyric poetry is revealed as all that has not partaken in the miraculous exchange under which the image of the stone and water could finally be passed and passed on, as though a mere idea of the cause of the oppressed. Where in parable the image is reduced to a symbol whose meaning might shine forth in the mystical instant, under the allegorical view, this poetry becomes a different type of language. Its lyric becomes lamentation proper, and the lyric subject transformed into one of the many who, unnamed and finally unnaming himself in collapsing, takes his place as a discontinuous moment among the ranks of the classes defeated in the continuum of history. It is therefore not in the fabulous tale of the sage that Benjamin's commentaries reach a verdict on the historical situation. The stream returns us to a landscape of the poorly marked street. The wisdom of the sage is neither the moral nor the lesson. Rather, what can truly be learned from him is a gesture found in his stopping to teach. To pause, to adopt this discontinuity in the journey is the hope of the oppressed. The Messiah is returned to the Via Dolorosa, in which his wisdom appears not as a promise, but as a rhythm of attending each station. Surely, if the wisdom of the sage rang in the ears like the promise of something messianic, it did so as a cosmic lamentation, straining between this intercession for the unredeemed and in its own discontinuous shape, in its own coming to silence, in its own realization of its transience, reaching to a future by not reaching. The sound of this cosmic lamentation, heard and unheard, returns us to the problems of historical registration in the commentary on The Sinners in Hell, with its location of Brecht's lyric in the lineage of lament. The combination of discontinuous lineage, the sound of lamentation, the problem of tradition is founded again in Benjamin's earlier body of work. In an early essay called On Language as Such and on the Language of Man, Benjamin wrote his first theory of lamentation, marking a paradox in language. And here we get the language caught on itself problem. Rebecca Comey offers a good summary. Once it's necessary to lament, there can be no possibility of doing so. By this very token, it is always necessary and thus impossible, and therefore all the more necessary to lament. Lament is either superfluous, were it possible to lament, there would be no need to, or impossible, the very need to lament is precisely the obstacle to be able to do so. And this double bind is in itself sufficient to merit lamentation. What is most to be lamented is the impossibility of lamentation. What is lamentable, in other words, is strictly unlamentable. What demands lament is simultaneously what precludes it. For Benjamin, this was not merely a paradox of a linguistic concept. Rather, lamentation staged a scene in the history of language between the language of God and the language of nature in the motion of its fall. Nature would lament if she were not mute, and her lament would point back to the morning of the very first day of her language in which she felt mute. That she may not lament is nature's melancholy, for she endlessly mourns her muteness. Benjamin concludes, quote, "In all mourning, there is the deepest inclination to speechlessness, which is infinitely more than the inability or the disinclination to communicate." Despite its theological setting, and despite nature being its character, this was a history of language. Benjamin quietly grants this linguistic history a topography. Man communicates himself to God through name, which he gives to nature, in proper names to his own kind. And to nature he gives names according to the communication that he receives from her. For the whole of nature, too, is imbued with a nameless, unspoken language, the residue of the creative word of God, which is preserved in man as the cognizing name, and above man as the judgment hovering over him. The language of nature is comparable to a secret password that each century passes to the next in his own language, but the meaning of that password is the century's language himself. The silent transmission of language corresponding to nature's muteness operates on a border, along which centuries who pass on the medium of language as their password. Language does not grant entry beyond the border, but defines its shape. For as long as this language extends horizontally, a judgment hovers suspended above it, between the languages of the centuries, who, as elements of nature, pass this password between them in their own tongues, and quite literally only between them as medium. This uninterrupted flow of the language of nature promises to conjoin with divine judgment through the translation of lower languages to higher ones. This occurs at the most inconspicuous point of infinite clarity, where the horizon of this border meets the heavens. Benjamin's friend Gershom Scholem responded to this text by writing an essay on lament and lamentation, intended as, quote, a true continuation of Benjamin's work. Scholem recast Benjamin's theory of communication in the lamentation of nature as a problem of tradition and transmission between generations. Taking up the topography of Benjamin's final sentences, he describes the language of God as the border between two great territories, the revealed and the silenced. Lament, he considered, was nothing other than language on the border, language of the border. Yet Scholem's essay lacked any account of nature. Lamentation had migrated from the fallen natural history into the religious history of a people. See if I can get this last quote up. That lament can be transmitted belongs to the great, truly mystical laws of a peoplehood. Not to everybody, but only to the children of one's own people can lament be passed down. What unheard of revolutions must a people undergo to make its lament transmissible? That an entire people speaks in a language of silence can only be surmised. This shift in the domain from a theological account of the history of nature with language as a communicative medium to a history of communal life in which the medium of tradition is composed of a language that annihilates itself in transmission as each generation's lament falls into silence, certainly made an impression on Benjamin. The history of fallen language is transformed into a social history of language, founded on a past revolution of silence. Yet the linguistic properties of such a tradition, which annihilates itself in the motion of its transmission, is homologous to Benjamin's later theorization of the discontinuity of the past, whose historical medium is the tradition of the oppressed. If Scholem's development of this idea provided a model for Benjamin, he nonetheless retained a natural history in the paradox of lament. He recognized that such a tradition, as Scholem described, might become the binding force in a mythic national community, which presented the greatest threat to the tradition of the silenced. In the name of tradition, mythic national communities would invoke nature not with respect to its silence and its annihilative force, but by naming it, bestilling it for the cause of their own mythic preservation. Nazi politics could never avoid invoking it by name. Nature's naming drew it into ever more mythic languages and moved it not so much into muteness, into the muteness of its disappearance, but into the mythic stillness. For those national communities, nature became as a condemned statue whose name must speak forever through the engraving at its foot, a monument to its own unfreedom. Rejecting both the old story of nature's mourning at the fall and the translation of the story of such a genesis into the myth of a national community, Benjamin explains the historical stakes of Brecht's lyric amid this profound new mythic stillness. Hidden within the commentaries announcing the time of the end of lyric is Benjamin's final account of lamentation, grounding the discontinuous history that provides the material setting in which the class struggle might newly, that is to say, be messianically construed in the sage's wisdom. Brecht's poems hark back to old laments in order to lament something new, that lamentation no longer exists. This is a pronouncement of world historical proportions. The great transformation underlying Benjamin's final words on lamentation views the paradox of lament inverted through the historical catastrophe. Where once lament was paradoxically present in the fall amid the mute language of nature, now lament is paradoxically absent in the terrible actuality of history as a silencing of the silenced. Nature has been supplanted by fascism, which claimed to master nature fully in asserting the endurance of its name. Fascism dictates the pace of all destruction in the name of its permanent self-preservation. Unlike nature, whose destructive processes, caught on its own falling, appear messianically in the tempo of eternal transience in which its mute language spoke, fascist destruction is apocalyptic and fixative. Lamentation's status required retheorization, not with regard to the reconciliation of nature and history, where the border touches transparently upon the heavens, but instead with regard to the apocalyptic and destructive end of all things, in which the two are absolutely rent and separated. The fascistic context of Brecht's biting, newly destructive, anti-fascist poetry, the absolute continuity to which the discontinuity of the tradition of the oppressed corresponds, is not the first day and its wound, its fall into muteness, to which language forever returns, but instead the perennial very last day, which will not cease. The judgment, the word of God, which once hovered over man, has fallen silent, fallen into man's own mouth, and as the judging word, and with the final gesture of defiance into the anti-fascist mouths, too, speaking the lyric of the end of the lyric, falls shut. There we are.
Thank you, Jacob.
I apologize, I don't really know what any of that means.
But also, I didn't have to stop you, so I'm amazed. And we have this beautiful pile of paper next to us. I want to, well, I think we have some time for questions. So also thanks everyone who stayed in the Zoom. And thank you all for being here. But I wonder if I can begin to ask a question.
Yeah, I don't know if I actually don't know if I have any answers, but yeah.
Well, I have some thoughts because I mean what you presented is was so imagistic and spatial.
Yeah.
And you really took us on a journey. And I also am kind of struggling to find a question because I'm struggling to to reconstruct the journey I just went on.
Yeah, it was a bit fragmentary.
It was quite fragmentary, but also I mean what is hard, yes, must yield.
Yes.
What is hard must yield, and this kind of invocation of friendliness in response to borders. I wonder if you could say something about like your first question, which was about seduction and temptation, and then this kind of invocation of friendliness.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
so the friendliness problem is this big problem in Brecht, and like people will know this like famous line from the end of the Svendborg poems, which is oh we who lay the ground for friendliness cannot ourselves be friendly, right? And so Brecht kind of says, well, you know, Brecht is a pretty rebarbative guy, right? And he's pretty unfriendly by all accounts, although friendly with certain people, right? I mean, and he has groupings who he attaches himself to. And so this is, and in this strange text on the, like this imagined future with a statue of him, where he's like, and I get a nice expression because I was so friendly to the future generations. You have this real, like, difficult contradiction. So, yeah, I like the friendliness problem is, it's really tricky, and it has to do with, I think it kind of has to do with what happens to Lenin in his first poem, right? Which is that, like, Lenin looks like he's going to stand firm, like this text is never going to go anywhere, right? It's just going to, the more you try to attack this text, the more it's going to like come back at you and reinforce itself, right? And then, like, you have this realization that no, it yields, right? It goes. This thing happens, the wall can go. Right, and so yeah, I guess this is this is also the border question, right? And you know, I think obviously like borders are incredibly like difficult territories in the world in which we live, and like we should play down just like the violence and brutality of what happens at borders, and not only at borders, right? Because like we often feel like when I'm in Schengen land, right, in this land where like all the borders that were on the outside once upon a time got internalized, and then they like drag people away and they behave like it's a border situation everywhere, right? But this is and yeah, what do you do with it? But also, I guess, oh, I'm getting unstable internet. I guess one of the questions here is, and I think I would say, of course, like friendliness means communism as well, right? And like the grounds in which friendliness, or maybe the grounds in which friendliness can be like truly friendly, are communist, is a communist situation, right? And so like it might also be that friendliness might not always be friendly until then, or after then. So yeah, I don't know if that's like a useful way to think about this. I don't know if this is like a particularly like relevant or useful way to think about borders at the moment.
Yeah, like, maybe that would have been another question, like how does it translate to the moment?
Yeah,
but maybe that's also like a bit of a cool, like mean question, because
I mean, it's
presented so much.
It's a mean question. It's but it's fine. Like I think as much as like, you know, if you're going to be seduced by images of destruction, then you have to be dragged through the meanness by your friends, right? And so like all of these social relations we can play with, you know, I think for obviously like Benjamin doesn't continue living, right? He dies on the border a year later, right? And in fact, like part of this work and part of like the rest of this work has to do with the poem that Brecht wrote for Benjamin, and another set of poems that Brecht wrote for Greta Steffin, who was his lover and like co-worker, horrible word, isn't it? Co-worker. But I guess that's Mitarbeiter, right? It's co-worker. But it sounds like horribly 1980s bureaucratic in English.
It does.
Yeah, so like obviously Benjamin doesn't carry on living, and so like one of these, so like one of the characters that's here is like in some ways you have to ask like, well, what does it mean to carry on someone else's critical project, right? After that decision is made or after that decision is forced. And, you know, I don't want to be terribly like historicist about this stuff. You know, I don't think that I'm just writing about the 1930s and I'm just writing about the 1930s. But I would also like say that there are problems of like translation, right? Yeah, I don't know.
Are there any other questions in the room?
I feel like I
Or
just
like
held stuff
Philip,
out.
yeah.
I actually have a thought. In fact, also it's very seductive language. Let's say evocative. I wrote half a chapter, I think, one of my own texts inspired called Missing. Maybe picking up first on that, on this poem, the Lenin poem, so this moment of breaking down the wall, let's say this iconoclasm of the notion of Lenin. There's also the moment of freedom for the soldier, right? So let's say, because this was what I was thinking about this now. The first thing was sort of, okay, this becomes stronger and stronger, but only by the dissolution of this icon of Lenin, actually freedom out of breaking out of prison is achieved. So in relation to, let's say, this breakdown of icons, this breakdown of concepts, and this breakdown of maybe also institutions and states, what is sort of the, let's say, this revolutionary moment that comes out of this dissolving of stirring of history, of things that you describe as a fascist concept? So what's the distinction between this dissolution to become free and then this wish of dissolving into history from fascist perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so that, as I've said, and I guess this is why I talked about destruction as a seduction, because I think we can't just, it's very easy to just argue for destruction, right? This is, in fact, one doesn't, how do I, let me start again. Let's get this in the right order. If you go and destroy things, you don't need to argue for anything, right? But at the point at which you're making an argument for destruction, you're already caught, right? Like it's already like a fatal move. It's to go and argue for destruction because we haven't just destroyed things, right? And so for those of us who are involved in making arguments, like we have to account for this problem that we haven't just gone and destroyed things. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't go and destroy things, of course. Like there are times, places, most of the time, most of the places probably, that could be clarified by destruction. But I also think we need to be like careful in that this kind of, okay, so like once you've started making the argument of destruction, once you've entered this sort of fatally stupid place, right, then you can start to make distinctions, because even being in the wrong, in this wrong type of argument, here is where you can make the analysis between your own like revolutionary forms of destruction and the fascist ones. Now, I've made an argument here that I think that like fascist forms of destructions are mainly like fixative, that they don't actually bring endings, and that they're, I would say that they lack a sense of discontinuity. Now that's like a kind of very abstract question, or abstract way of answering this question. How do I distinguish like the good destruction from the bad destruction? Yeah, I mean, I also don't think it's easy to find ourselves in a situation in which there isn't just like destruction all the time. And yeah, I should probably just say, like, it's been incredibly like weird trying to prepare this talk while there's like a war starting, like actually today, and that feels like incredibly like messed up and odd to be like having these conversations in that context, although perhaps useful, right? Yeah, I mean, so I would say also like that this isn't straightforwardly like readable by consequence. Like we can, it's common, right, to in the prosecution of fascism to say, well, fascism does bad things, right? And that's one of the problems of fascism, but it's not all of the problems of fascism, because also the processes that take you to those bad things are also pretty bad, right? And so, like, it's all well and good to say, well, we can prosecute it as like a crime after the fact, and we can work out what's fascism from historical analysis, but to ask the question of like, how do I recognize fascism here and now? or like, how do I identify whether my own impulses are fascistic or not, right? This really important thing, or which bits of my impulses are fascistic or not. Like this, I think this is something I'm like trying to offer some heuristic for, right? Even if it's not a particularly helpful one, because it ends up with the theology of language and whatever, you know. Like, yeah, I would say that those are the sorts of questions that which they're like practical politics, right? But I would say, you know, when you destroy things, yeah, if you're interested in destroying things, then like neither destroying things for something which is fixed in its novelty, and neither destroying things because you want to fix the image of destruction. Those are probably quite good things you can avoid, and like those are quite simple things to avoid. It's asking me to take the
what?
take the title down so they can see me.
Oh, I see. Can they not see?
Let me see if I can
Yeah, you can
stop share.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see us now.
But also, like other questions in the Zoom. I'm not like in front of the computer. Okay. Are there any other questions in the room? Or comments?
Zoom user says, I thought the text was invincible.
Do you have any comments to that?
It's not.
It's not.
It's not. That's the point.
Okay, Zoom user.
Sorry, Zoom user.
I might have like a question, but it's not going to be well formulated.
That's good. I'm not going to have. I will have a badly formulated answer.
Yeah, also having my head. But thank you. It was really wonderful to listen. So like I'm left with three images because I'm also going to focus on borders, but with three images of how to actually come across a border. And of course, you tell us like about the destruction, right? And so like in the, I kind of understand the image of like the symbol, this dissolution of the symbol to cross that threshold, since you've also talked about like the horizontality of language and the so like the horizontal language, but kind of like this verticality of the divine world takes us like above it. And so what I think like what I'm also not clear about is actually the image of like the gesture of transmission in the poem with the initials BB, which actually in which like the poet has to destroy themselves or their text. And I'm kind of like unclear of the necessity of actually like blocking, so like there's like so creating this border from the side of the oppressed. So yeah, right.
Okay.
Because like the third one, which is also the sea, the fish. So it's kind of also it goes around this pause and the promise of transition, and then there is like some kind of like left between these like contradictions of how you're like made to pause on a border by the oppressive, and but then also like having to make that border yourself as an oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think this is like a super interesting. It's a super interesting question. I would say that it's not straightforwardly making a border, but it's making a blockage. And so, like, I guess, like the nature of borders is that they tend to bound sovereign territories, right? And I mean, okay, so like this is I guess kind of complicated because of course we do have many borders which don't. I sort of think about the American frontier in the 19th century, which is like bounded on one side by a sovereign territory and on the other side by like this lawless terrain, right? And like how it constitutes a border or a blockage on either side is complicated. But yeah, I would say that yeah, I don't think we have to, we certainly don't have to imagine the sorts of interruptions we might make of history as borders. And like that, in fact, might be like a bad way of thinking about it. And like for one reason only, which is that I would hope that communist history does not elect communists as sovereigns, right? And so like we do have to be incredibly careful of this. And so yeah, that I guess is one answer. And then this stuff on the border of adaptation.
Sorry, can you just repeat this last sentence once again, because I couldn't hear well.
I was saying that I don't think that I would hope that communists wouldn't like elect themselves as sovereigns in history, and that like the bounding of communist history wouldn't be like a border making, but it might be constituted out of like the blockages of ruined borders in someone else's history. And I can think of some other people's history who I might want to like riddle with broken borders as blockages, right? And I guess this is like, it's really difficult now because there are like lots of ways to think about this stuff where communism, like if you put like traditional image of like internationalism, right, is that you just have this like it's universal territory, right, in which everyone could just pass through everything all the time, and that's kind of fine. I see that as a bit too much of a like high politics determination, because I would like to see like the bringing to life of the texture of space itself or something like that, which seems to me to be like a better way to think those problems rather than like maintaining the same structures of sovereignty. Yeah, I don't know. I will have a think as well about like this the late borders and the language theology stuff, which I don't know what to do with the Sholem text. It's a strange text. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'll carry on moderating. Are there any other comments? No? Are you really tired?
I don't know.
Okay.
I feel very quizzed, and like having read a text where I like wrote it and then I have spent a while not knowing quite what it means, and then like answering questions, I'm just like, oh, I know it's even less.
Okay. Well, then perhaps.
Yeah, well,
thank you very much, Jacob.
Well, no, thank you for having me. It's been like a pleasure, and yeah. I
feel like I need to think more about the bringing to life of space.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe over a pint or two.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, thank you all for listening to my
yeah
babbling.
No, it was really wonderful.
And yeah, and thank you for everyone who's on Zoom who's been listening.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay.
Oh,
thanks,
Zoom
everyone.
user says thank you, comrade. Okay. Excellent.
Thank you, Zoom user.
Thank you, Zoom user.
Okay. Thanks.